Okay, let's begin. Ladies and gentlemen, I care about you, and I also care about a beautiful thing known as knowledge. So, in the spirit of knowledge, we're going to have a discussion about the world. And the world has a lot of stuff happening, so we brought on the very own world-renowned expert, codename Agent Smith. His knowledge is so broad-based and magnificent that we can't even give you his real name. That's how top level this is. So pay attention. If you have questions, you can ask in the chat and he will maybe respond to you if it's appropriate. If it's not, then your question will be thrown into the dumpster. So thank you for being here. I'm here to learn as well as you. And we're gonna keep playing some StarCraft games for episode 38 of World Discussion with Agent Smith. Thank you, Moss Neotech Prototype, for handling those questions. Let's rock and roll. Welcome, Agent Smith, to episode 38. So, dude.
Hello? Hello?
Hey.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty legit. We're doing pretty well.
Oh, still got momentum?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Nice.
We got, like, 800 or something viewers with no hosts from anybody. Oh, no, I think we had one host that was 100 or two, but yeah, it's definitely kind of brought us to a new tier, and we seem to have stabilized there. So I did take a couple days off to give my body some rest and whatnot, but yeah, we're doing quite well with the stream. It's been some good stuff. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Can't complain.
The huge.
Yeah, status quo.
Nice. Well, it's better than being attacked by an alien invasion.
I would not disagree. Well, anything over the past week catch your eye?
Well, there's always too much to hear about Trump. I didn't see anything with the Mueller drama that really caught the public eye as much as some other stuff that we've seen. But yeah, not really overall. What have you found?
Not much. It's a pretty mellow week. No new threads really, just the usual stuff developing, basically. Well, I thought I might start by offering some corrections from last week.
Sure.
Because I had some angry Ukrainians after me.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I mixed up the name of Yushchenko with Poroshenko. Poroshenko is the current sitting prime minister, and Yushchenko is a previous prime minister from back in the Orange Coalition days. So I mixed them up. My mistake. My apologies.
Please forgive.
Also, apparently it's Ukraine, not the Ukraine.
Yeah, we both made that mistake, so I guess I should apologize as well. I thought has it changed? Because I know Americanization of stuff sometimes causes us to have our own way of making a mistake.
Well, apparently the Ukraine is what the Russians called it before Ukraine became independent.
Oh.
So post-independence, it's just Ukraine.
I could see how that might be upsetting a little bit.
Yeah. So there was some people in chat letting me know about it. There was one guy who said that I was wrong about saying that Russians were not in control of the breakaway provinces in Donetsk and Lugansk. I'm still not sold on that. I know that the Russians have a significant amount of influence, but I don't know if you can say they outright control them, per se. I could be wrong on that, though. Who knows? You know, the exact relationship is not exactly open to the public. But I don't know that you can inarguably say that the Russians outright control the separatist movements there. That's just me arguing that. But the other two were legit mistakes, so putting that out there for anybody who listened last week.
Do you think that admitting that you made a mistake is going to hurt your credibility moving forward?
No more so than all the other goof-ups I make.
Okay.
there are mistakes now and again. It's not as though people don't notice them.
Yeah.
You know.
The beauty of being a person who broadcasts and makes content is you get to make mistakes for hundreds of people. And then if we build the stream up even more and your podcast and SoundCloud blows up, then we can even maybe make mistakes for thousands of people.
Well, here's hoping.
There's the dream.
Yeah. Well, the nice thing is they let you know when you make a mistake, so you have a chance to go back and check your work, so to speak. So
Yep.
I appreciate people contributing in chat and critiquing and keeping me honest. That's definitely encouraged. I learn as much from this as anybody else, so I definitely encourage people to contribute. So that said, I guess just to start things off with a couple events, so to speak, there's an upcoming vote in Macedonia. Do you remember talking about Macedonia at all back in the day?
It's been a while, hasn't it?
Yeah. Oh, sorry, it's not Macedonia, it's Macedonia. I was getting bitched out for that too a couple months ago. Macedonia. Macedonia has this name dispute with Greece. Basically, Greece is using its veto power in the European Union and NATO to keep Macedonia out of both organizations. And the dispute is around the fact that Macedonia shares the same name as a Greek province in the north of Greece. And the Greek, well, certain Greek politicians and Greek people insist that the Macedonians are harboring territorial ambitions, that they think that northern Greek territory belongs to them. And that if Macedonia and its government wants the Greek government to relent, then it needs to change the name of the entire country. So obviously that's difficult to do politically if you're Macedonian. So that tension, that issue has been ongoing since, what, late 80s, early 90s, thereabouts. It's been going on a while. But there was finally an agreement hashed out over the past few months or so. And basically the agreement is that Macedonia will change its name to North Macedonia. And then in exchange, Greece will, hypothetically, stop stonewalling Macedonian integration into Western institutions. So there's an election coming up in Macedonia, a referendum to determine whether or not the public is on board with that. And it's caused a lot of division. You know, there's a lot of partisan rhetoric because some people don't want to change the name. They think the country's name should be its name. They don't think they should have, you know, they should have to negotiate over it. So people are upset about that, and there's accusations of Russian interference. So there's, you know, allegations that this, that, or the other opposition group is antagonizing, making the situation more tense than it would be otherwise. So that's something to watch for in the news. Greece already, I think, passed the agreement in their parliament, so to speak. There was some tension over that, but I think they did eventually give that the green light. But Macedonia has not done so yet. So that could be colorful depending on the outcome, especially if the referendum fails. So I thought that was pretty interesting. That's a long-running thorn in the side of Balkan politics for some decades now. So you might actually see some traction there.
Yeah, we don't, I think, in the US really get that much time to think about and follow Balkan politics. One of the only instances I can think of in media was the Behind Enemy Lines movie with Owen Wilson.
Yeah. Yeah, there's been a couple Balkans movies. Usually they have to do either with, well, like the one you cite, or they have to do with the human rights violations, of which there were quite a few in the 90s. Yeah, it's not... If you live in the Balkans and you're listening, you're not... Just know this, you're not really in the public eye, so to speak, here in the United States, and probably also not Western Europe. It's kind of something... The Balkans it exists, we're vaguely aware of it, but it's not something we really hear a lot about regularly. In fact, there are some accusations that the Washington establishment, foreign policy establishment, also hasn't been paying enough attention to the Balkans, and that the United States needs to have a more assertive, or at least have a Balkans foreign policy of some kind. Because really, over the past couple decades, after the civil wars ended in the mid-90s, after the Dayton Accords, basically, U.S. involvement in the region has been pretty minimal. I mean, obviously there was Kosovo and all that, but beyond that, interests is very intermittent, if that. Generally, we just wait for the Europeans to call us, so to speak. You know, if they call us and say there's something wrong, then maybe the U.S. government will do something, but otherwise it's not really considered an American problem. It's kind of left to the Europeans to sort out amongst themselves.
Now, I think you could kind of plot also the distance from your point of reference and the area you're talking about. So Balkans are pretty far away, and they're also kind of surrounded by a lot of other regions that kind of have their own theater that plays out. So it doesn't really overlap too much with the Western Europe or United States theater. But they have a whole host of stuff to be concerned about too.
Yeah, I mean, I think immigration is still the big one. I mean, next to settling some of the lingering frozen conflicts and that kind of thing, I guess that's pretty important too. But the immigration issue has kind of come to the forefront and been a principal driver of politics in the Balkans with regard to the European Union, anyway. But there's also tension in Bosnia and Herzegovina that's still kind of unresolved. Part of the agreement that saw the end of the wars in Bosnia was basically carving Bosnia in half. So the north became, I think, Republika Srpska, which was the Serbian part, and then the south became, what was it, the Croat Bosniak Federation or some such thing. And basically that was the Croat and Bosniak part of the population. Bosniaks are basically Muslims who live in the region, or in Bosnia in particular. And both of these two statelets basically have their own government, and they're only technically a part of Bosnia by virtue of being governed over by a single Bosnian federal government of a sort that basically combines representatives from both regions. But that national government's power is pretty weak, and there's always kind of some degree of tension between the statelets and that national government, which I think still has some UN appointed officials, or is it EU appointed officials? I guess it would be EU. So there is some discontent over that sort of issue of representation. Not all of those institutions are elected. That was thought necessary in order to try to prevent the two sides from going at each other. It was thought there was a third party, ostensibly neutral arbiter, would be needed. For the most part, the Croat Bosniak Federation, for lack of, it must be called something else by now, but basically that southern statelet with the Croats and Bosniaks, generally they're okay with the status quo. Generally, the discontent comes from Republika Srpska, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, but there's a lot of Serb nationalists who are irredentists. They want to be a part of Serbia, and there's some, obviously, the EU is very reluctant to allow that because it rewards bad behavior, basically. You know, the whole reason there was an intervention was because forcible change of borders in Europe is a very sensitive issue, and there's a great fear that, you know, if one country or group changes borders through force, then some other group will try to do the same thing. So there's always a strong desire to try to avoid that. That's one of the reasons Russia's been in so much trouble. There's a strong aversion to the Crimean annexation and the precedent that set in terms of the context of Europe. You know, if you want an example of how bad it can get, just go back to the 1930s. You know, a lot of that was driven by ethnic rivalry and disagreements over borders that stemmed from the outcome of World War I, when a lot of empires in Eastern and Central Europe collapsed, and there was an attempt made by the League of Nations to try to carve out those territories into roughly what constituted ethno-states. states dominated by one ethnic group or another. But given how intermixed the population was, it was always very difficult. You know, there was always a minority basically who were upset about the country that they had ended up in. You know, a good case study for that is the city of it's called Lvov now. It used to be called Lodz, I think. Again, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. But the city had been a part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And obviously that broke up after World War I. But there was a question of what to do with that territory around Lodz. The city itself was, if I remember correctly, it was mostly Polish, ethnically. But the territory around the city, you know, the rural areas and whatnot, those were mostly, I believe, Ukrainian. And that created a big problem because the populations, I don't think, really leaned one way or the other. It wasn't like clear cut whether it should be a part of a independent Ukraine or part of an independent Poland or just what to do with it. So it actually ended up being settled by war. Basically, the Polish army linked up with some Polish nationalists who were fighting in the city and fought off the Ukrainian nationalists, and it ended up being a part of Poland. The city of Lodz has a very interesting history. It was very dramatic. I think it ended up being in something like half a dozen different countries over the course of the early 20th century, just by dint of changing borders. But that kind of instability is what drove a lot of instability in Europe at that time. And there's always, as a result, there's been a significant aversion to any kind of forcible change of borders in Europe. There's a strong desire to try to settle that through third-party institutions or negotiations or anything but conflict, basically. So the Balkans kind of opened that old wound up, and so even though there's pretty decent support, I think, for an irredentism, for merging Republika Srpska with Serbia in the Republika Srpska, the European Union doesn't really want to allow it because the Serbian government had, during the wars, propped up that effort on the part of the Serbs in Bosnia. So it's kind of seen, they're afraid basically that that could instigate further conflict and maybe encourage other would-be ethnic nationalists in other parts of Europe, if not, again, the Balkans, to start conflict again. You know, again, Europe as a whole is in general pretty risk-averse, so it's no surprise that they really don't want to allow significant dramatic changes unless they're heavily negotiated. The European Union gets accused of being heavily bureaucratic, but there's reason for that. Anyway, I'm not sure how I got onto that. Oh, Balkans, right.
Macedonia,
Balkans, yeah. Yeah, there's lots of different ethnic tensions in the region, you know, Albanians in particular, everybody shits on the Albanians there. And then there's case studies like the Transnistria Republic over in Moldova. That's, again, a separatist republic. That's nominally propped up by Russian peacekeepers, quote-unquote, peacekeepers. And and there's a long-standing tension between Hungarians and Romanians. It's not really that big a problem now, but there is a large Hungarian minority in sort of, well, Transylvania, basically, northwestern Romania. And so Hungarian nationalists in Hungary in particular have long wanted that territory back in Hungary, as it has been at different points of history. I think it originally was Hungarian territory when it was still part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And then after World War I, a whole bunch of Hungarian territory got basically carved up and handed out to different groups. So the actual state of Hungary as it is now is significantly smaller than the original the original Kingdom of Hungary, as it was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Anyway, I'm just meandering now. Let's get on with something. Oh, there was also the Idlib offensive. You know, we were talking a bit last week about how the Syrian government it looked like the Syrian government was going to try to attack Idlib province, potentially putting them at odds with not only Syrian rebels, but also the Turkish government, which has a presence there. And they ended up backing off. There was a agreement reached between the Turks and the Russians, I believe, And the agreement was that they would create a buffer zone between Idlib province, well, the parts of Idlib held by rebels and the rest of the Syrian government-held territory. So the offensive is probably not going to happen, at least not in the near to medium term. That's been delayed by this agreement. And the question, though, is whether the Turks can kind of police their territory there. There's a lot of radical groups there. Amongst, there's a lot of different groups in Idlib province, a lot of different rebel groups, but among them are very radical groups that don't particularly like being told what to do. They don't really take cues from the Turks and Turkish intelligence. So it may be that those groups sabotage the agreement by launching attacks through or over the buffer zone, rather, which could force the agreement to collapse, and then we're back to kind of square one. Whereupon it comes down to basically a battle of wills over who's willing to commit more to the defense or conquest of Idlib province. But for now, for those following Syria events, that's the newest update there. Ceasefire there. So at this point, Idlib and eastern Syria are basically frozen conflicts. The Syrian government nominally wants to reconquer both territories, but doesn't really have the power to do it without significant backing, and it's not clear that the Syrian government's backers really want to commit enough to take on the difficult diplomatic and military cost of helping conquer either Idlib or eastern Syria. So everybody is kind of waiting to see what happens. Everybody's kind of waiting to see who makes the first move, or better yet, seeing what the United States finally decides what it wants to do, since U.S. preferences have been very ambiguous in Syria for some time. Can't quite, to use American colloquialism, the United States government has not been able to determine whether it wants to shit or get off the pot in Syria, so to speak, and that's created some difficult diplomatic calculations for everybody involved. So
well, you could just play Hearthstone.
Or you could just play Hearthstone. There you go. Write your congressman. There you go. Resolve the Syrian diplomatic impasse. But yeah, that's frozen for now. So we'll see. Something to watch. Anyway, that's those are the big ones, I think. The major events. There might have been some others I'm forgetting, but those are the ones I thought I'd mention. I think we did have some questions, and I guess before we get into the questions, I'll make the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything we talk about. I have a stronger background in some areas than others, and so chat is definitely encouraged to contribute, or rather, people listening are encouraged to contribute in chat. If I say something stupid or biased or wrong or what have you, I definitely encourage you to chime in and keep me honest, so to speak. Again. Well, I don't read the chat while we do this, but I will read it later, so I'll see it eventually. And I do learn a good deal reading through the comments, because a lot of people listening have different perspectives, insider knowledge of one kind or another. So always very interesting to get those perspectives. Definitely encouraged. I would definitely encourage people to participate as much as they're comfortable with. Obviously, if you don't want to, I can't make you. But hopefully, we have an open environment where people feel free and comfortable doing that. So let's see. After the fairly recent vote about food regulations in Switzerland, I was wondering what's happening in terms of new regulations or deregulation on the part of the IPA. What is the IPA?
India Pale Ale.
That's the first thing that came up. I googled it. Yeah, Indian Pale Ale. I don't think that's probably not what he had in mind.
Do you know about that though?
No, I don't. What is it?
So India Pale Ale was something that the British had to figure out how to do once they were colonizing India and stuff, and the ales that they enjoyed having didn't really hold up under the different temperature of India as opposed to the climate of Britain. So what they did was they created a new type of ale that can be stored at what is a little bit warmer than room temperature, and because of this, India Pale Ale is super popular in places like Texas because Texas is hot as fuck. So a lot of people in Texas really like different kinds of IPAs, which came from India, just so that people can store it properly. Isn't that awesome? Yeah, I don't know the chemistry behind it. Someone could probably explain that, but that's kind of the history of it.
Well, that totally justifies 300 years of colonialism.
We got some beer out of it.
Why complain? We got beer. Yeah, I'm Googling around, but I don't think I'm getting at what IPA is, so I would ask for some clarification there. I don't know that I would be able to contribute too much to this question, though, because I'm not that familiar with food regulations in Switzerland. I know they had the referendum recently. I was reading about that a day or two ago, or whenever it was. And for those not familiar, basically Switzerland, well, for one, it's very easy, relatively easy to have a referendum in Switzerland. If you want to call one, you basically just have to get enough signatures and there's, boom, a national referendum. I'm sure it's a little more complicated than that, but basically, not uncommon for Switzerland to have referendums like this. And in this case, the referendum was over changing regulatory law vis-a-vis the food industry in Switzerland. And they had a bunch of health-conscious type stuff. I don't remember the details exactly, but it was a lot of things like more humane treatment of animals and more organic support for the organic food industry and basically things like that. Oh, he meant EPA, not IPA. Okay. Well, I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't know much about what the EPA is doing either. I can't imagine under the Trump administration the EPA is being terribly proactive. You know, in general, Republican administrations prefer administrative agencies to be more relaxed in terms of their approach to regulating the private sector. So I suspect there's been a concerted effort on the part of appointees in the EPA to try to cut through the fat, basically, cut out the fat, to try to find regulations that are old or irrelevant and to either cut them out or not enforce them because they're irrelevant. And there's generally no shortage of inefficient regulations of one sort of rules and laws and what have you at the national level of any country's regulatory regime. It's not that unusual. If you want an example of that, look at Texas. We still have a Texas Rail Commission, I believe it is here, which is nominally responsible for regulating the rail industry in Texas. But it's actually not, its principal role is actually regulating the energy sector in Texas, if I remember correctly. And that's basically an archaic leftover of 19th century politics. A lot of rail companies and whatnot bought a lot of land and ended up with in control of a fair amount of resources. Because in the United States, when you buy land, you own everything under it. You know, I know some other places outside the United States have the law such that when you buy land, you don't inherently own any minerals that may be under the ground. So somebody else could hypothetically buy the rights to those minerals and then mine them out from under you, basically. But here in the U.S., you basically own all the land on your plot of land all the way down to the core of the earth, so to speak. So if you are a mining industry, or rather a mining firm or some such, and you want access to mineral deposits or oil deposits, as the case may be, then you kind of have to go and negotiate with those people. There's a lot of people here in Dallas, actually, municipalities that made a lot of money over the past 15, 20 years, leasing rights to gas under their territory. So, you know, you're just somebody kind of living on the fringe of the Metroplex here, and then somebody will basically come to your door and say, hey, there's a big gas deposit under your property. Will you lease it to us for, you know, X amount of thousands of dollars every year? Sure. A lot of people quite happy to make that deal. DFW Airport actually did that, because there's a fair amount of I think it's either natural gas or something like that. I think it was natural gas, but maybe I'm wrong. But basically, DFW Airport was able to help their budget out significantly, so to speak, by leasing out land like that. So that's just an example of how that works, of how archaic institutions don't generally evolve too much unless you go out of your way to try to keep them up to date. And here in Texas, we tend to be pretty lazy about governance. Our institutions are a bit old, haven't been updated in a while. So similarly, there's generally things like that in law that you can pick out and as being archaic and not needing further enforcement. And that kind of helps out industries that are relevant to said law, because then they don't have to worry about getting slapped by some random prosecutor who maybe is looking to score some points and tag some firm or some such on what amounts to a frivolous charge. I think, what was it? Maybe you remember this. We had that case back in 2006, whenever it was, and went to the Supreme Court. It was a case where some policemen busted down a door. I don't remember what exactly the context was, but they caught two men having sex. And that's technically illegal. That was technically illegal. Sodomy was actually technically illegal in Texas at that time, and nobody had been convicted of it in forever. And you know, they just happened to catch them in the act, and so it was bizarre circumstances led to a prosecution, a charge being levied basically on this old sodomy charge that again hadn't been used in forever. Just an old archaic law from back in the day. So it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ended up shooting it down as discriminatory or some such. I forget the technical ruling. Again, lots of archaic laws on the book. But anyway, I'm not sure what the EPA has been doing lately in terms of any major changes to the regulatory regime vis-a-vis the American food industry. If I had to guess, I would say probably, again, probably the focus has been on deregulation, but I can't answer the question in any great depth without really knowing specifics. So I apologize. Not quite something I'm familiar with. Didn't stop me from dragging out the answer for 10 minutes, though. Well, if I can't answer a question, try to give you something to chew on, something maybe new that the listener isn't familiar with. So hopefully that's not too abstract or distracting, but just a little something for your time, basically. What are your thoughts on the idea that the three large powers, US, Russia, and China, are similar to the War of the Three Kingdoms, but on a worldwide scale? And you know, I keep meaning to read about the War of the Three Kingdoms, and I still haven't got around to it.
It's a lot to read about. I bought the books. Yes, it's a lot. It's a really epic story. It's kind of like, I don't know the exact period, but it kind of feels like Sun Tzu, but with more of a fiction feel to it. It's likely based on a lot of actual characters. I'm actually not an expert here, so this is just what I vaguely remember. But yeah, I think
you're right.
It's a very classical text, and I think a lot of people in countries not just China read it for school. Like other Korean people I've talked to, I think also read it. And in Chinese culture, lots of people, basically everyone knows about it. It's just a really landmark set of texts, but it's 3 huge books. I actually have it over in my bookshelf over there. It's pretty cool. It's one of those things where it's the stories, and then you have a bunch of different cool characters in it, and then there are lessons to be learned from a lot of the events that happen.
Yeah, I think it is based on actual history. I think there was a period where there was 3 kingdoms. Well, there's been a couple periods where China's been broken up like that, but I think the literature in question refers to a particular period when there were 3 competing kingdoms.
Someone's saying it happened hundreds of years after Sun Tzu, 180 to 130 CE.
Oh, there you go. Thank you, Chad.
Cool. Well, from our small-minded American perspective, everything in China is ancient, and everything in US, we have like a drop in the ocean worth of history compared to China.
Well, maybe I can help out people who are kind of in that, have that perspective, you know. And again, I'm not a big China history guy. I don't know a whole lot there, but just roughly speaking, there was a period of history in which there was a number of very wealthy, successful, thriving civilizations all existing at the same time. And so that was roughly, let me see if I can, the Roman Empire for one. And then, hell, what was it? The Mauryan Empire in India. And at the same time, there was, I believe, the Qin Empire in China. And again, sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. So the Qin Empire is actually where the name China comes from. Maybe it's pronounced Chine. That would make more sense.
Well, it's probably all Americanized the way we say it anyway.
True. There you go. But Qin Dynasty roughly corresponds to the Roman Empire, and it was the big empire in China at the time. It was one of the wealthiest, most stable periods of Chinese history, if I'm remembering correctly. So for those not familiar with Chinese history, you can kind of use that as a focal point. You can kind of center around that Roman period. That's something that you can kind of relate the time period to. Later on, there was the Song Dynasty. And that's my personal favorite, because you've probably heard a lot about the Chinese inventing a lot of impressive things, like well before they were created in the West. You know, paper, gunpowder, you know, etc. And there's a lot of inventions, advanced inventions, you know, impressive scientific development that occurred in the Song Dynasty specifically. It was well known for that. So there's a decent chance that if there's some impressive invention you read about the Chinese developing before everybody else, there's a decent chance that was developed during the Song Dynasty. So that's another aspect, that's another tool you can use to try to remember that, the Song Dynasty and innovation. And roughly that's Song Dynasty was, I want to say 1300s, 1400s, right around there. They were eventually overthrown by the Ming, I think.
Well, one of the things that we can see in a lot of other instances in history is you get periods where it becomes really fashionable and cool to fund new tech projects. Like the Enlightenment was one of those periods where it was really awesome to like know a young bright kid who was poor as shit but wanted to do science and just throw money at them, and that was like really cool. So you could probably imagine that as being a similar time period where they really valued technological progression and invested heavily on those fronts.
Yeah, it was a very wealthy period for China. And so, like you say, there were lots of wealthy patrons about who could invest in that kind of activity. There's also a fair amount of war, too. That also instigates development. There was I think it was the Manchu. No, it was actually the Mongols. Actually, yeah, I think that was it. The Yuan dynasty, I want to say. Basically, Mongols invaded and pushed the Song dynasty to the south, and that was the period of history called the Southern Song dynasty. And roughly, I think that was the Chengjiang River was the northern border of the Southern Song dynasty. I think that was, oh, hell, what was it? Oh, Chengjiang is, what's the, not the Yellow River, that's the Huanghua, but then, what's the other one, Neuro? I'm blanking out.
Yangtze?
Thank you, that's it. Yangtze is what we call it in the West, the big southern river in China. Chengjiang is what they call it in China. And I know I'm butchering that pronunciation.
Well, we can butcher the pronunciation together.
Your pronunciation in Chinese is pretty good. I remember you would get compliments on it back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where if I hear someone say it right before, then I can usually mimic it pretty well, but it's more of a mimicry skill than a deep understanding of how Chinese works.
Oh, sure. But still, that's a useful skill for learning new languages, and that's definitely one I don't have. Don't mimic me. I'm not pronouncing it right for sure, so definitely don't mimic me. Let's see. How the hell did I get onto that? Oh, okay. What are your thoughts on the idea that the three large powers, US, Russia, China, similar to the War of the Three Kingdoms, but on a worldwide scale? Well, again, without being familiar with War of the Three Kingdoms, I can't really critique the analogy there.
I would say it has a scale problem, first of all,
Yeah.
because that was very local, close to the ground, next door neighbor kind of a situation, whereas between the three world powers that are listed and also the way that current power struggles work in the non-warring capacity, it's a very different ball game. You wouldn't really translate that analogy. I mean, maybe you could reach for some stuff, and I think that's a fun mental exercise of seeing how similar patterns emerge from an old system into a new system. And as a mental exercise, I'm sure you could draw some similarities there, but just the way that the nations work now and the way that they relate to each other, it's very, very different.
Yeah.
And the thing with the Three Kingdoms is they're all kind of part of the same cultural lineage, whereas Russia's from its own distinct cultural lineage, China's from a very different one, and the US is from a very different one. Mm-hmm. So what we prioritize and what we would consider a good way to live or to govern and that kind of stuff is all different.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would add to that, because I think that's as good a critique as I could give. Those are all valid points. But I would add, I think the Three Kingdoms in China were roughly equivalent in power, but that's not really the case with the U.S., China, and Russia. Mm-hmm. You know, Russia is not a world power, and you know, I pissed off the Ukrainians last time, so now I get to piss off the Russians. So, yeah, Russia is not a world power. It's not in the same league. You know, it used to be kind of when it was the Soviet Union or the Russian Empire, but not so much now. It's more of a regional power at this point. And yes, it can project power into, say, Syria, or the what the Russians call their near abroad. But the level of power, economic and military, that the United States and China can bring to bear is much greater. You know, that's one of the reasons the Russian government really leans on tactical nuclear weapons and their military doctrine. You know, there's a sense that they really need those in order to make up for, in the case of the West, the technological gap, and in the case of the East, the quantitative gap. Either way, they kind of need something to even the playing field, and nukes are that. You know, Russia's just so damn big. It's really hard to defend. And there's just not enough people.
Well, but a lot of it is empty space, right?
Yeah.
Like Siberia and stuff is a huge, huge area of land that is almost not inhabited at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the population of Russia east of the Ural Mountains is about 40 million people.
Mm-hmm. Which is neighborhood of Texas.
Yeah, Texas, California, kind of right around there. And so it's not much, considering the scale of Siberia. And I think pretty much everybody else lives in the European part of Russia, Russia west of the Ural Mountains. So it's very difficult for the Russian military. I mean, it's always been difficult for the Russian military to defend that territory, even more so after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when the Russian military has to make do with much fewer resources. I think in the 1980s, the Soviet military ate up something like 40% of the Soviet economy. Not just the budget, but the economy? Maybe it is budget. That sounds more reasonable. Basically, paying for the Soviet military ate up a ridiculous amount of resources. It was really bone-crushing. That's in stark contrast to the United States, which even at the height of its spending spree in the 1980s, I don't think ever spent more than maybe 3% of its GDP on its military. Wasn't much, but they got a lot for that dollar, for those dollars. A huge military, just a huge military in general. The Soviets also had a large military, but were much more hard-pressed to keep it that size, basically. So, with the loss of resources after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian state has kind of struggled to find a balance between Russia's huge geographic size and the limited resources available to the military. So that's roughly why Russia is not quite in the same league as China and the United States. That's to say nothing of the economy. You know, China's economy and the American economy are much larger and much more diverse. and much more dynamic. In the case of the United States, you could also make an argument in the case of China. But Russia's economy is not stagnant, but it's heavily dependent on oil and gas. It's not as diverse as the other economies, and it really struggles with corruption. Corruption really is a major disincentive in Russia to entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial activity, and it puts a severe crimp on efforts to modernize and develop. That's not to say that Russia doesn't have advanced industries of one sort or another, but they're not really as dynamic as some of their competitors. They tend to lean on government support. Certainly in the case of the military industry in Russia, I think there was a big effort, I think 2007, 2005, something around there. There was a big effort by the Russian government to basically unify all of the major military industries in Russia under one conglomerate. And it was called something like Robosonexport or some damn thing, something like that. Not a company per se, but just a conglomerate that was roughly intended to be an umbrella institution through which the government could more easily influence and help maintain the industry. Maintaining an industrial base is a big reason why you see a lot of military deals and whatnot. Why governments of countries with large military-industrial complexes generally get heavily involved in defense deals, because it's very difficult to try to have enough orders continuously coming in to your defense base to try to maintain that defense base and maintain skilled workers in those industries, because otherwise, if skilled workers become unemployed, they go find something else, and then you lose that skill set, hypothetically. So there's a big struggle. There's always a big struggle to try to get enough orders to try to keep the factories open. It's one of the reasons U.S. foreign policy is kind of geared the way it is. I'm not saying the U.S. foreign policy is designed just to generate orders for the military-industrial complex in the United States, but that is a motivating factor. That's also the gist of a lot of internal politics in the United States and Russia. Where do you locate which factory? How do you generate orders, etc.? Because those are employers in those different districts, and so politicians generally try to prop them up. It's one of the reasons that the A-10 refuses to die. Great plane. I think the Air Force, well, actually it's the Army, isn't it, that operates them? Well, it kind of gets a bad rap from the Defense Department, because the Defense Department wants to get rid of them, because they think they're too specialized. The Defense Department, and to a degree Congress, wants aircraft that are multi-role, that are flexible, that can do more than one thing. But the A-10 is just so damn good at that one thing, close air support, that people are loath to part with it. So there's this kind of tug and pull between, for one, the factories that produce it, and the politicians who represent those districts, and the military itself, which wants to move away from that model, so to speak, of aircraft. Wants to shift away from having specialized but also more expensive aircraft to something that's, well, not more expensive aircraft, but move away from specialized aircraft to general aircraft that can do multiple roles. And the idea is that you can save money by doing that. Lots of tangents today. Not sure why.
Because they're fun.
Well, let me walk that back a little bit. Basically, I'm just trying to explain why I don't think Russia is a world power. So for that reason alone, I don't think you can say that the competition between China, Russia, and the United States is quite equivalent to the War of the Three Kingdoms. It's a kind of a different ballgame. The United States is still the heavyweight. That's still the preeminent global power. China is a rising power. It has a lot of power, for sure, economic principally, and also increasingly military, but it's not nearly at the same level as the United States, at least not yet. And then Russia is, again, I would argue, mostly a regional power. Enough power to project force slightly outside their region if they want to, but it kind of stresses them to do that. So I hope that meandering answer makes some sense. I hope that's satisfactory. if I ever give an answer that doesn't really get to the gist of a question somebody asks, that somebody should feel free to elaborate on it, and I'm happy to come back to it. Let's see, with the news about China's investments in Africa and how it's perceived in the US, I would love if you could talk about hard and soft power approaches to foreign policy and its effectiveness in the long run. Yeah, that's, so for those who aren't familiar with hard power and soft power, hard power refers to things like military power. Well, I guess principally military power. That's hard power in a nutshell. Soft power refers to tools that are a little more indirect, like economic influence or even cultural influence. Like in the case of the United States, we've long painted ourselves as the paragon of liberal democracy and the defender of human rights around the world. Obviously, that's debatable, but nominally, that's what the US government stands for, so to speak. And so there are people, and sometimes even governments, that are attracted to that message and so pursue friendly relations with the United States, basically because of that. Doesn't happen very much, but nominally that is a helping factor, so to speak. It helps the United States have better relations with the rest of the world and exert influence. So economic factors and cultural factors are an example of soft power in diplomacy that you can use. You can use human rights or economic influence to try to coerce or otherwise push a foreign government towards a set of decisions that you would prefer they take. That's roughly, in a nutshell, what hard and soft power is. Now, there's a debate about how legitimate a form of influence soft power really is. You know, some people have really criticized it as being too soft, basically, that it's not a real lever of power, that yes, you can have economic sanctions and that exerts some power, but ultimately it comes down to hard power. That's sort of the old realist versus liberal argument in international relations. You know, to what degree are relations predicated on just pure hard power realist calculations as opposed to more fuzzy economic and political considerations? It's probably both. I mean, they're not mutually exclusive, but the framing of the debate often puts them at odds, and so people kind of argue one side or the other. So I guess in this case, with regard to this question, the soft power would be China's investments in Africa. So by investing in Africa, the Chinese government gets some leverage over those governments because, one, they don't want to be cut off from the funds. You know, they want the investment to keep coming because it helps the economy, and also because they probably steal some. You know, corruption in Africa is very real. That's not to say that all countries in Africa are just utterly irretrievably corrupt. You know, it's obviously a spectrum. There are some that are much better than others, but a lot of countries in Africa do suffer from corruption, and investment from China is a vector through which a corrupt politician could extract resources. You could extract funds and build your patronage network. So there's an attraction there as well. So for that reason, it's attractive that China could threaten to pull the investment, and that could be a credible threat that could succeed in maybe changing a government's decision in Africa to something else that maybe is more amenable to Chinese interests of one sort or another. So that's a form of soft power, but you know, without hard power to back it up, how legit is it really? Like if you are an African leader and you want to default on debt you've taken on from China, like if you take a bunch of debt to build projects and you know, do this, that, or the other. What if you just decide, all right, I'm not paying that back? What are they going to do? You know, without some hard power to act as at least a little bit of a deterrent there, you could argue that that's a much more viable option than it would be if China had much more hard power in Africa. Now, that's not to say that there's not economic levers that can bring. Again, you can cut them off from further loans and whatnot, but ultimately, hard power is the final arbiter. You know, if Uganda invades Tanzania again, you know, China's not going to be able to do much about it, whereas the United States hypothetically could. Might be a bit difficult, but hypothetically, the United States could intervene and have an influence there, whereas China would be much more hard-pressed to do that. So hard power probably is a lot more influential when you get right down to it than soft power, because that ultimately really gives you much more forceful, powerful, potent options in exerting influence in other regions of the world or countries than just economic or cultural influence can. You know, if you want an example of that, you can look at the Iran nuclear negotiations. Iran is hypothetically, well, definitely, Iran has definitely been building nuclear weapons, and so there was a big push to reach some kind of nuclear deal to try to have a negotiated resolution to that dispute, because obviously Iran building nuclear weapons violated the nominal non-proliferation regime that presides over the world today. But the principal tool used to try to deal with that, to pressure Iran, has been an economic set of tools, economic sanctions. And as we've seen, limited effectiveness. It's a mixed bag. You know, maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but thus far, it's not explicitly clear that Iran will not at some point develop nuclear weapons. Now, in contrast, a hard power solution would resolve that pretty quickly. That's not to say that it's not a sure thing, because the Iranians have been going out of their way to fortify, you know, their various installations and whatnot. And I'm sure they could rebuild it if they really wanted to. But airstrikes, hypothetically, would definitely put a crimp in any nuclear development plan, any nuclear program that the Iranians have. And if probably the United States were to continually bomb out those installations whenever they were rebuilt, then problem solved. Not an ideal solution. Obviously, different people will have different opinions on the ethics of that. But in whether or not it solves the issue, whether or not it actually prevents the Iranians from developing nuclear weapon, the answer is probably. That would probably be an effective means of doing that. Again, legal questions, ethical questions, but just in terms of raw power, that is a efficacious means of pursuing that objective. So hard power in that sense kind of has the edge. But you could argue that over the long term, soft power means more. You know, the United States was able to build a very powerful set of alliances with powerful nations. You know, the big edge, one of the big edges the United States had in the Cold War is that our allies didn't suck, so to speak. You know, the Soviets had allies around the world, but they either were uncomfortable with the Soviets, like the Chinese ended up being, that led to the Sino-Soviet split, or they were just very weak. You know, technically the Soviets had a number of allies in Africa, especially later in the Cold War, but they were just beset by problems, you know, economic or military. You know, Ethiopia flipped in the late 70s, but immediately civil war, basically for the next 10 years, right up until the end of the Cold War. Angola and Mozambique were the same thing. They flipped when the Portuguese Empire collapsed in, 1975, but immediately civil war. And then there was Republic of Congo and, Guinea, I think, also, and Benin. But as you can imagine, these are not exactly economic powerhouses. They were largely dependent. So the Soviets did not have great allies during the Cold War. They were not particularly dependable, or when they were dependable, they were not particularly powerful. Whereas in contrast, the United States had basically all of the heavy hitters. I mean, Western Europe was still a colonial powerhouse well into the, 1960s, 1970s. And, that's to say nothing of Japan, Korea, Thailand to a lesser degree, more so in Southeast Asia. Indonesia, certainly, once Sukarno was overthrown and Suharto came to power. So lots of powerful regional powers and, global powers even. There's a reason the UK and France have a seat on the UN Security Council. So that put the United States in a much stronger position relative to the Soviets. Even if the Soviets could maybe challenge the United States itself, the US had so many more powerful allies that it tipped the scales back in the US favor. So hard power, to kind of walk that back, hard power definitely has an edge, but soft power over the long run kind of facilitates the construction of large coalitions of nations that maybe kind of make up for any deficiency in hard power over the long run. That's not to say that a pure realist hard power consideration could not result in the construction of a coalition. There's a whole set of realist literature about how it's perfectly rational for coalitions of alliances to arise in response to an overarching threat. So hypothetically, within the internal logic of realism, that's perfectly viable. But then the counter argument is, yes, but would they still do that if they were at odds for some reason or another, maybe nationalism or ideology or whatever? Even if there is that overarching threat, could they overcome other tensions in relationship? And so that's a viable argument too. certainly France, during the Cold War acted in certain ways that were inimical. Is that right? I'm tripping over that. Basically, in ways that were counter, let's say that, to American interests, or certainly American preferences of one sort or another. So that's kind of the downside of powerful allies. They generally use that power to kind of have a mind of their own and pursue their own interests, even if they sometimes are at odds with the larger allied power. So roughly, that's a quick and dirty exploration of hard versus soft power. Hard power is probably the more important in terms of results, quick, direct results, but you can argue that a softer power is more important over the long term in terms of, one, constructing larger coalitions, and two, having those coalitions be deeper. They're rooted in something more than just hard interests. They're rooted in common values. Generally, that's cited as the real strength of the European-American alliance, such as it is. It's not just an alliance predicated on strong economic ties or common threats faced in other parts of the world. It's predicated on a common set of values and common set of political and ethical values that kind of undergird that relationship. So that's something deeper than just pure realist considerations that makes the alliance stronger than it would be otherwise. Again, a soft power argument. That's what I can get off the top of my head. Hopefully that's sufficient. It's been a while since I've read that literature. And again, if I'm missing something or forgetting something, please do point it out in chat. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So please do throw that in there. Let's see, what are your thoughts on the trade war happening with China? Yeah, it's probably going to keep going. I don't think that's going to be resolved anytime soon.
Tariffs.
I just think tariffs, yeah. That's what it comes down to. Those aren't going down anytime soon. Because I think there's just a fundamental misunderstanding between the Chinese and American governments about who has the leverage in the relationship, in the trading relationship.
Speaking of that, we actually did have a viewer who's been listening to the Agent Smith segment who had direct work-life evidence of how the tariffs have changed their business.
Yeah, you sent me that email.
Yeah.
Or he sent me that email and you redirected it. Yeah, that was let me see if I can remember specifically what it was. He worked in, I think, a metal shop. Is that what it was?
Yeah, I think it had something to do with the price of the metal for fences and whatnot.
Fences, that's what it was. He was in fences, and the price of the raw materials needed to produce fencing went up significantly. And so this person's place of work, had to basically cut back on demand by limiting orders to, I think, public companies. Not public companies, but public sector entities, basically the government. And they also would only take orders that gave more than 6 weeks leeway, something to that effect. Basically, they just couldn't produce as much because it cost too much, so they had to cut back production. That was my impression. If this person is listening and I'm just getting this absolutely wrong, please do correct me. But basically, that's all because of tariffs. The raw materials became significantly more expensive because of the tariffs, and so this business, along with similar such industries in the U.S. that depend on steel as an input, are kind of getting hammered.
Tariffs.
Definitely stinging. Yeah, there's a very large established literature in economics about international trade and specific sector trade and how particular political groups respond to trade, and there's a lot to dig into there. But without getting into that, just focusing in on China and the United States, one of the things that comes up a lot in discussions about it that I see in comments to articles and whatnot is that the United States has the leverage because it has the trade surplus. It exports more to China than it imports, and so the Chinese will eventually knuckle under because they're getting hurt more. That's not quite a correct reading of how trade relations work. It's true that that Chinese economic actors export more to the United States than they import. True. But that doesn't mean the United States doesn't get hurt by that. there's a lot of people in industries in the United States that benefit from cheap inputs from China of one sort or another, or cheap goods from China. So if you raise tariffs, then you're impacting those industries. More to the point, even if China exports more than it imports from the United States, it's not as though it's a pure accounting calculation as to how they set trade policy with the United States. It's not as though just because they export more than they import, then they're going to back off, because there are political calculations that go into that that will supersede the economic consideration. So, for example, in the United States, people who work in industries impacted by cheap Chinese imports are the ones who most want, not a trade war per se, but want China to be confronted about unfair trade practices. But most people don't work in those industries. Most people don't work in industries that are affected by China one way or the other. You know, the largest group of people that are impacted by trade with China are consumers. And consumers benefit from basically cheap goods from China because it's cheaper stuff. That's not to say that people are not impacted, you know, that they don't care that people lose out from trade with China, but in general, consumers are the biggest interest group. But because they don't benefit a lot at an individual level, it's not really a powerful political group, right? You save how much from free trade? Probably not a whole lot. You probably don't notice the 10, 20 cents you save on each individual food product you buy that you benefit from because of free trade, or, you know, the couple dollars you save on a shoe because it's made in some other place. So even though consumers writ large reap a huge benefit in total from free trade, at an individual basis, you don't really notice it that much. It's not really huge. It adds up over time, but it's not enough to make consumers a singular, powerful political bloc that pushes for more free trade. Now, in contrast, there's relatively few people that work in industries damaged by free trade, but those people are very concentrated in particular regions and industries, and so it's much easier for them to lobby the government for one kind of trade policy or another, generally anti-trade. So that's an example of how political factors are more important than economic factors in determining trade policy. Generally, there's a battle between industries that benefit from free trade and industries that are hurt by free trade. And ultimately, a country's free trade policy kind of comes down to which of those is the more influential, or which of those has the more it can trade to other political groups in exchange for supporting a free trade agreement. So here in the United States, we have anti-free trade forces basically ascendant. Because for one, obviously there's a number of people who have been hurt by free trade, but also there's a sentiment, a broadly held sentiment amongst broad swaths of the public that free trade is just bad, that it serves to deindustrialize the United States and hurt its power and economic standing and the wealth of its citizenry. That's a whole other debate we could get into, and it's complicated. But for now, roughly, it's that interest group that's kind of in the driver's seat on trade policy. And that's the reason why the Trump administration has been able to be so hawkish in trade negotiation. So what about the Chinese? Well, obviously in China, it's all about the Communist Party. The Communist Party of China is in the driver's seat. Nobody else really gets a lot of input there. The Chinese Communist Party is only going to knuckle under and change its trade policy if it believes that it's in its interest to do so. And right now, the United States is neither bringing enough pain to the table in the trade relationship, nor is it offering enough carrots to sway the Communist Party of China.
Carrots.
Because, yeah, tariffs. But
no,
however...
carrots!
Oh, carrots. Sorry, my apologies. Enough carrots instead. Yeah, there's not enough being brought to the table to change their mind, because it's not just about maintaining the trade surplus for the Communist Party of China. Economic policy in China right now, as set by the Communist Party of China, is all about modernizing China's economy. They want to shift the Chinese economy into, if not a fully developed economy, then at least something near to that level. Because right now, there's a lot of people who graduate from college in China who can't find jobs in well-paying industries. There's a lot of industries in China that will hire a lot of people but don't really pay them particularly well. And so that limits opportunity for people in China. So developing modern industries that are well-paying is an important factor to try to quell any potential discontent from the population, because it doesn't want everybody to just have shitty, low-paying factory jobs. It wants, better jobs for the broader part of the population, so that they have opportunities and don't start blaming the party for this, that, and the other. Now, let me think for a minute here. Now, there was another factor to that, but it's slipping my mind. Well, less dependence on exports is another factor, because if your economy shifts to a more developed economy, it generally is more consumption-based. But basically, part of the government's plan is to shift the economy not only to be more modern and industrialized, but to be more based on consumption rather than investment, which creates problems, because there's a point of diminishing returns beyond which you can't really invest further. There's only so many bridges and infrastructure projects you can build before it basically just comes back to bite you. Infrastructure projects do give something of a return to the economy, because it facilitates more economic activity than you could do before. But again, building empty cities doesn't really help anybody. And that's kind of the point of diminishing returns. If you're building an entire city that nobody lives in, that's a problem. Because generally, people take on debt. Economic entities or local governments take on debt for those projects. And so if there's not some kind of return at some point, then that's just dead weight. That's going to weigh on your balance sheet, and eventually that builds up and becomes a problem. That's one of the criticisms of the Chinese economy right now, is that there's too much debt sloshing around in the economy, especially in state-owned enterprises. And that maybe if the Chinese economy does not really start to deliver on that modernization that the government wants, that there's going to be defaults on that debt and it could crash the economy. That's debatable. Again, that's a whole other subject of debate. But that's kind of the fear. That's the foreign criticism anyway. But having a consumption-based economy kind of gets around that. Also, it gets away from having an export-dependent economy. China's economy is not as dependent on exports as it used to be. It used to be like 30% of the economy, but now it's more around 10. So it's not as though the Chinese economy really just needs exports in order to continue to thrive. They can kind of eat the trade wars, so to speak, and still kind of carry on growing, which is pretty much what they've been doing. It does hurt, so to speak. They would rather have that growth than not have it, but the Chinese economy is not so dependent on exports now that a trade war is going to be catastrophic for them. Now, that said, the shift towards a consumption economy is desirable partly because it shifts away from the export economy, because that makes China less dependent on trade partners. And China isn't any more averse to nationalistic arguments on trade policy than anybody else is. There's lots of people in China who don't like that the Chinese economy is so tied to the American economy. There's a fear that the United States could, hypothetically, who's to say, use that trading relationship to coerce the Chinese government into doing something that it doesn't want to do. So there is a nationalist argument there as well for that modernization program. There's also a desire to develop modern technologies. One, so that the Chinese military can have its own, basically, defense industrial base, so that it doesn't have to be as dependent on, say, Russia or other producers. There's also a desire to develop modern technologies as well as new technologies, so that it's more likely then that Chinese producers become the pioneers in that industry, and in turn China becomes the location, basically, the ground zero for the development and emergence of that industry as it blossoms into a significant economic force. Basically they want to be the first mover in a new industry so that they can reap disproportionate advantages. So all of those are different reasons and different factors in the Chinese government's economic policy. And you can see how political considerations kind of undergird all of those objectives. So it's not enough for the United States just to say, look, you have the trade surplus, that means we have the leverage because you export more. That doesn't account for the political considerations. And the Chinese government is a lot more worried about losing legitimacy because of a lack of economic growth or economic opportunity in China, and a lot more interested in the development of its technologies and military than it's afraid of anything that the United States could hypothetically do in the trading relationship. The United States would have to bring to bear a significantly greater amount of pain to overcome those political considerations on the Chinese side. And the United States probably can't do that by itself. It would probably need, at the very least, Europe to coordinate on a common set of economic tariffs and sanctions in order to try to push the Chinese government to offer significant concessions that would satisfy the anti-trade people, so to speak, in the United States. Satisfy concerns about unfair trade practices, let's put it like that. So, for that reason, I don't think the trade war, such as it is going to end anytime soon. I think fundamentally the Trump administration thinks it's playing with a stronger hand that it actually has. And the Chinese government, for its part, is just not interested in concessions and is perfectly content to incur whatever losses in the trade war are necessary to kind of wait things out. The Chinese government, as well as pretty much every other government in the world, is basically in a wait-and-see mode on the Trump administration. Because there's a suspicion that this might be a flash in the pan and that maybe he just goes away after 4 years and then maybe normal diplomatic relations kind of return after he's gone. So there's a sense that everybody can just kind of wait things out. Unless the Trump administration starts working with other allies to put pressure on China, that's probably where things will stay going forward. Until he either gets pushed out, loses office, or gets reelected, at which point the calculus changes again. Because that suggests that maybe the Trump administration, its style of politics, and its preferred policies are not a temporary thing. Not just an aberration, but possibly a new norm. That would change diplomatic calculations further and create a new equilibrium. Who's to say what it would look like, but roughly, that's what would happen. So I guess that's a rough outline of where the trade war is at the moment. Some thoughts on the trade war happening with China. I don't see anything change. Short answer, there's nothing will probably change in the short to medium term. Unless the Trump administration changes its strategy to start cooperating more with Europe or other countries. Beyond that, I don't really know what more they could do beyond just enacting more tariffs, which seems more likely. I think there's another set of tariffs to be implemented basically on the entirety of Chinese imports to the United States, set to go into effect within the next week. Or maybe that was last week they did that, I don't remember quite. But beyond that, beyond more tariffs, the only other thing you can do is raise tariffs. And beyond that, maybe you could start leaning on American trade partners to curtail trading ties with China. That would require a lot of diplomatic capital that I don't know the United States really has at the moment. Even if it did, it would be a problem because it would basically carve the world into American and Chinese spheres of influence, and the United States doesn't really want that. The United States government does not want spheres of influence in the world. It nominally wants an even playing field. Again, debatable, but nominally it wants at least an economic even playing field, and if the United States forces the issue, that could result in a number of countries saying, look, we trade more with China than we do with you, so we're going to side with them. So, in that sense, it's probably better not to force countries to decide. But that's my opinion, per se. I think there's a good argument to be made for that, but that could hypothetically happen, I guess is what I'm saying. That is a possible direction they could take once they've basically put all the tariffs they can put on China and increase them as much as they can increase. You know, beyond taxing the actual trade relationship between China and the U.S., the only other thing they could do is go outside of China and the U.S. and start trying to push other countries. That could be the form of cooperation that I was mentioning, but again, a number of countries would not do that. You would have to focus in on major trading partners like Europe in order to really bring enough pressure to bear. Sound like a broken record at this point, so I'll let it go. Just let it sit at that. But I think that's about as much as I could say on it off the top of my head. That's a rough outline of where that trading relationship is at the moment. Let's see, are there any flaws in the Western public education model? How do you believe education should be structured? Inspired by the Jesuit education model.
There are plenty of problems.
Yeah, I mean, one of the problems in the United States in particular is inequality. And let me elaborate on that, because that word triggers some people. So just give me a minute. But basically, there's a lot of variance in the United States in terms of the quality of education. There are some parts of the United States that have elite world-class education, and then there are some parts that are basically third world. There's just a lot of divergence there. And it comes about partly due to a lack of access to resources. There are some places that just don't have the resources to spend on quality education. There are some places that do have the resources, but don't spend them very wisely, and so they end up with suboptimal outcomes. There's a lot of different factors there, and a lot of it is regional. The South and a lot of areas that suffer from deindustrialization have been hurt particularly hard. And so education generally is not as good in those places. But then there's places like, generally suburbs, or the northeastern U.S., or big, broad swaths of the west coast of California that are very, very good. It just depends on where you want to go. So when people criticize the United States and its education system, it's not just a matter of educational policy. Some of that is parochial specific problems in particular areas. Part of the problem is just spatial. So in that sense, the reason that's relevant is that if you want to improve education in the United States, you need to come up with solutions for those specific localities. It's not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution. You're going to have different policies for different areas to try to help them out and help them improve. So that said, what are some specific things that you could do differently in the United States, or perhaps the West generally? Because the West is a very broad category. Education within the West, differs greatly. There's a lot of variance even there. In Germany, for example, and if there's some Germans listening, you can correct me on this if I get it wrong. But in Germany, basically, they give you a choice of technical school or an alternative arrangement that prepares you for university, basically. And I think that's late high school that they do that. So that could be a much better arrangement than what we do here in the United States, where it's basically just figure it out yourself. We don't really do a lot of preparation unless you pay for it, or more accurately, your parents pay for it. Beyond that, it's basically just figure out what you want to do and figure out what you need to learn and learn that. Find a college or a technical school and then kind of go from there. But there's not a lot of assistance or preparation for that, and really, it's not even a decision that's explicit. You could argue that preparation for adulthood is very poor at the high school level in the United States. So certainly there's a lot of room for improvement there. Things like basic financial literacy is probably something that really should be taught in secondary education in the United States, and it isn't. And I think it is in other places, but here in the U.S., not really. You have to go out of your way for it. There might be some schools that offer it, but it's not universal. It's not a requirement, and it probably should be. So things like that. Also, probably government should be taught differently. We have government classes that are taught here, but it's generally a bullshit class. It teaches you more about roughly how government institutions are designed, more so than about rights and responsibilities and laws, which should probably be more the focus. So that would help immensely, I think, if people had a better understanding of the legal system. When you have as many laws as we do in the United States, it probably would behoove us to try to teach people how the legal system works and what those different laws are. It's a very litigious society we have here in the U.S., so you'd think that more would be done to try to prepare people for that. So those are some things we could do that the Europeans kind of already do to be helpful. I don't know about funding. You can make the argument that it would help more to try to redistribute funding to poorer districts to try to help them out, but you would have to do that at the state level, for one. For those not from the United States, education in the United States is heavily state-based. It's not really something done at the national level. The federal government does distribute some resources and sometimes uses the distribution of those resources to strong-arm states into policies that maybe they wouldn't otherwise do. But otherwise, it's almost all done at the state level. Almost all of the curriculum and requirements and or rules, requirements, what have you, all of that is done at the state level. And so any kind of significant change would happen at a state-by-state level. You know, you can try it at the national level, but you would probably encounter so much resistance that it wouldn't really be feasible. You know, an example of that is the No Child Left Behind law, which was passed under the second Bush administration. You know, they wanted to try to create more of a national standard for education so that it would be easier for education researchers, in part so that it would be easier for education researchers to compare and contrast different schools to try to see what different schools were doing right, what they were doing wrong, and try to come up with a set of proposals for best practices, basically, for schools. And the same thing was done later with the Common Core legislation under the Obama administration. And both of those efforts were very unpopular because they took power out of the hands of states. States wanted more decision-making authority and discretionary power in terms of how they manage their education system, and people are just very upset about it. And there's been a big shift recently back towards giving more power to the states. Anyway, you could argue that more could be done if education were more nationalized, but I think it's a dead letter here in a federal system like what we have in the United States. The country is just too big and diverse to have a one-size-fits-all education system. But you could make an argument. Sorry, go ahead.
Another issue that we've talked about in some of these previous episodes is the question of what high school and middle schools are supposed to do, because a lot of times the schools kind of have the aim of, we want to send as many kids to college as we possibly can. And if that's your perspective, then a lot of times some of these classes, you're expecting them to learn this material at the college level, but as we've talked about, not everyone wants to go to college, and that doesn't necessarily fit their kind of desire as a human being. Like, university education, it really works for some people. Like, they love that environment, they thrive in that environment. Some people, it's really, really boring, and they just want some practical skills so they can get a job and kind of level up on some track, kind of a thing. So that's another point where it's tough to optimize the education system for all the different types of education the different types of people need.
Yeah, that's a great summary. I mean, there's just so many different ways to educate people and different personalities and different approaches that, yeah, you just can't do one size fits all. As the old saying goes, different strokes for different folks. Yeah, it's really hard to analyze education specifically because it is more inherently qualitative than quantitative. And kind of like I just was talking about, efforts to try to change the education system to make it more quantifiable so that more analysis can be done generally generates a lot of backlash. So, I mean, invariably, it's something that you just have to do qualitatively. And that qualitative analysis is just inherently limited in a lot of ways that make it difficult to come to objectively good policy proposals. And that just speaks again to what you were just saying, what Neuro was just saying, that it is a very qualitative process that differs for different people and is just very hard to nail down in a way that is easy for a bureaucracy to manage systematically. Which is why I would argue it's probably better to have a very decentralized system so that different localities can customize their schools and education system to how they think it should be. And so that can result in experimentation where a lot of different people try different things, and then we can kind of get an idea for what works and what doesn't. You can't really do it systematically, so there's always going to be some question about whether what works in one area will work in another. But I would argue that the decentralized, broad-based experimentation approach is going to be more effective in the long run than trying to hammer everybody's education system into the same shape so that you can kind of compare and contrast, see what works. That's a debatable topic, because there's a whole literature about education that you could get into. So those are some thoughts on laws in the Western public education model, so to speak. I guess that doesn't really critique Europe's education system. I probably flattered Europe more than I critiqued it. But
it's kind of hard. Again, we don't live in Europe, so
yeah, we don't live in Europe.
More direct personal experience here. In Texas, we ask 2 questions when you're deciding where to move if you have a family and kids. How's the education system and how good is the football program?
Yeah, that's all too true. That is very true. One of the things people from outside Texas, certainly the United States, are consistently the most surprised about here in Texas is just how much money is spent on football at the high school and college level. It's pretty crazy. Think of it as a cultural institution. It's not just a sport, it's a cultural institution here, so people embrace that. And so it's kind of like publicly funding a temple, almost. You know, it has that same role that temples used to have in ancient Greece. It brings the community together to a degree. So that, if you're confused by that coming to Texas, that's kind of what it is. It's not just a sport here. But yeah, we do spend an immense amount of resources on football in particular. I remember we had a very nice stadium when I was in high school. I don't know where they got the money for it, but you know, when it comes to football, they find a way. Yeah, for sure. I don't know. I can't think of anything on Europe that I could really critique. I'm just not really, like you say, I'm not really quite familiar enough about it. Critiquing Western education, broadly speaking, is probably a little too broad. You know, Europe has its own institutions and a whole different mindset and approach to it. Teachers are better paid, for one. There's a lot of teachers here in the US who probably could make more working at a gas station than they could being a teacher.
That's kind of also part of the cultural problem, too, is I think it was in School of Rock, if you want to use an example from media. He said, those who can't do, teach. Those who can't teach, teach gym. So it's kind of seen like, if you're going to be a teacher in the public school system, which you could say education is a very noble and important endeavor for the long-term viability of a society, but we just have the perspective that it's not as flashy and glamorous as a lot of other career choices. So if you're a teacher, that means you must have failed at being an engineer or some other thing.
Mm-hmm.
And if we took teaching as a more serious and awesome role, then we would pay our teachers more and respect that discipline.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people tend to be very critical of teachers and certainly administrators here in the United States. There's a sense that they're glorified babysitters, that they basically just watch the kids and the quality of education is kind of poor, and so that it doesn't really matter. It's just kind of a feedback loop of negativity, and it doesn't really facilitate the construction of a quality education system or the improvement of it. Mm-hmm. There is merit to the criticism of public education here in the U.S., that it is kind of subpar in a lot of places. You know, even at the high school I went to, which was not a bad school, it was a decent, probably pretty average suburban high school. You know, even there, they were a little bit stretched for resources, although there was a reason for that. But yeah, they're even in a relatively nice middle school, nice suburban high school, you'll struggle to find all of the right talent, all of the qualified teachers, all of the financial resources that you need to really kind of provide a first-class education that really prepares people for life after their public education. It's one of the reasons people tend to really go for private education here in the United States. And for you limeys listening, private school is what we call here, what you guys call public school, confusingly. I have no idea why you do that.
What does limey mean?
That's an old American term that we used to refer to British people.
Oh.
That's the old-timey nickname we gave to them.
Didn't know that.
Yeah, it came from British sailors were given lime to fight scurvy. I think that's what it was. This is like 1700s or so. So Americans started referring to British people as limeys. It was originally just British sailors, I think, but the term basically spread. It evolved from its original meaning to just refer to just British people in general. I think that shift happened around like the late 1800s. I'm not an expert on linguistics. I just happened to read the Wikipedia article on this, so take this for what it's worth. But basically, that's the history of the term. It's not in use as much anymore. I don't think a lot of people use the... well, I don't think a lot of young people use the term limeys. I'm a fan of anachronisms, so I like throwing out words like that occasionally. But yeah, I don't think it's something that everybody is all that familiar with anymore. But anyway, those are some thoughts on education. I would be hard-pressed to critique Again, I keep trying to think of European education and what I could kind of critique there. I guess you could say that the system of, what do you guys, I guess it's called gymnasium or some damn thing. Basically that system of making kids choose between technical school and university at an early age isn't entirely fair, because if you're a kid, you don't really know what you want to do. So I suppose there's criticism there.
I was gonna say, if you're a college student, you don't know what you're gonna do.
Yeah. Yeah, so you could say the American system is more flexible in that sense. And I do think in the United States, one of the things that we do well is encouraging talent and entrepreneurship. You know, we have magnate schools, and parents generally encourage hobbies amongst their children. You know, Microsoft was famously founded basically out of Bill Gates' garage. So that kind of spirit is something that we're pretty good at a cultural level of inculcating. It's not done at an institutional level. It's not something that's done necessarily at the school level. But there are schools that are kind of designed to do that, and just in general, the culture really encourages and facilitates it. So that is something I would argue that we kind of do better here. You know, in Europe, it is much more machine. What's the word I want? Like a machine, basically. Somebody can help me out with the adjective there, but you know, robotic. Let's say it's a little more robotic in that it's not quite as flexible and kind of allowing people to explore and experience different things and whatnot. This is especially an advantage that the United States has over China and the Chinese education system. You know, China has an undeserved reputation for having an awesome education system. For one, there's a lot of inequality. I mean, there was a famous study done, I don't remember what it was called, but it was done by an international institution that ranked all of the education systems of different countries. And China ranked very highly. But if you look at the methodology for the study, they went to basically the best school in the city of Shanghai, which is, you know, a very wealthy city and has a lot of resources to spend on education. That school, or that set of schools, was basically the sample for China. As you can imagine, that's not terribly representative of China. There are a lot of people, a lot of kids in China who grow up very poor. You know, the rural areas of China still make up something like 40-some% of the population, and they really struggle. You know, educational opportunities for them are limited, suffice to say. And even in the other parts of China, the emphasis on rote learning is not great. You know, it's good for instilling basic facts, you know, basic knowledge, but it's not necessarily good at encouraging creative thinking or entrepreneurial activity, entrepreneurial spirit, so to speak. And so when kids kind of learn that way and then go to college and then graduate, they're not necessarily well prepared for the private sector, which is very dynamic and very hurly-burly, very competitive. You know, the attitude, and not just China, but East Asia in general, towards business is very much one of constructing an iron rice bowl, so to speak. You know, it's very much about risk aversion and trying to find a niche, trying to find a rent, basically. It's not quite as dynamic or competitive as Western economies in that sense. It's not to say that they're not successful, can't innovate, or that they can't develop new technology, but the business culture in East Asia is just very different in that regard. The emphasis is less on risk-taking and is more on the sure thing. You know, for example, the business culture in East Asia is much less forgiving of business failure. You know, if you fail at business in East Asia, then that kind of sticks with you for life. You may not be able to find another opportunity. In contrast, in the United States, failing at business is almost par for the course. Like, that's what happens. You try to start a business, something goes wrong, you learn from the mistake, and then you go on and make something that's successful. Or you fail again. You just keep trying, basically.
That's experience.
Failure is a part of the learning process. Yeah, it's experience. That attitude is one of the advantages the U.S. economy has over East Asia in that regard. So in that sense, I might have lost my train of thought there, but in that sense, that's something the U.S. education system has as a strength that we kind of do better. Let's see, where were we? Do you work in an analyst position, or do you have degrees in political science, economics? I have two master's degrees, one in economics, one in public affairs. kind of similar to political economy, but public affairs. As for being in an analyst position, no, I'm basically a neckbeard who lives in his mother's basement. Let's put it like that. It's not everything went particularly well after grad school. Let's say that. But no, I'm not an analyst. I do have a background. I did go to grad school for a very long time, and ended up with 2 master's degrees. Yeah, there's a false impression that economics is different than a liberal arts degree. It's kind of not. Economics is basically a liberal arts degree, so I'm basically one of those jobless liberal arts graduates who has trouble finding work after they graduate. I have something that's, I think, more useful. Economics is probably more useful than, say, you know, pottery design or something like that, but in general, I went with a more qualitative angle in grad school. And that is kind of more the liberal artsy form of economics than the more hard microeconomic stuff that could kind of get you more of a job as a business analyst, say. And here's some advice. If you want to get a degree in economics, double major in something else, like business. Because economics by itself is not necessarily inherently employable. Again, you can, especially if you prepare, which I did not do when I was getting my bachelor's. But, you know, if you go out and get an internship, get some experience, you know, kind of figure out some industries, build some contacts, yeah, you can definitely make an economics degree work. I didn't do that because, again, liberal arts approach to college, not the best approach. Yeah, so that's kind of roughly where I'm coming from. Let's see. Have you been following recent developments in the Brazilian presidential elections? Why, yes. Yeah, I've been following it. I'm not sure where else you want me to go with that question, though. That's a little limited. Yeah, roughly for those not... I guess I could say this. For those who have not been following Brazil's elections, basically this is an anti-corruption election. Everybody was very upset at, Dilma Rousseff, who had been impeached over corruption allegations. She was the successor to Lula da Silva. I think that's his name. And those were basically left-wing candidates. After Rousseff's impeachment, she was replaced by a right-wing candidate, but right-wing politician named Temer. I apologize if the pronunciation is off. I believe his name was Temer. He also had a bunch of corruption allegations levied against him. Basically, levying corruption allegations is a form of political attack at this point. It's a way that you can go after your rivals, and normally there's kind of an understanding that you don't get too crazy with it. In countries like Brazil that struggle with corruption, you're generally more targeted with your corruption allegations. You know, you try to make sure that you have a critical mass of support such that they can't really turn it around on you. But basically that system broke down, and there's just a cascade of reciprocating corruption allegations, so everybody and their mother has had them levied in Brazilian politics over the past few years, and the result is that the public is sick and tired of corrupt politicians. That means, in turn, that they're tired of establishment political parties. So there's still a lot of support for Da Silva and his people, but it's not nearly as great as it was. And the traditional right-wing parties also having trouble. I mean, there's a lot of different candidates running in the presidential election, and I don't think any one of them has really quite got critical mass for support. But the big surprise, and the thing that's been in the news a lot lately, is Jair Bolsonaro, who's kind of this far-right candidate, he's on record for saying a lot of controversial things, you know, sterilizing the poor. He accused one woman of not being pretty enough to rape, basically. Lots of little things like that. Well, okay, you could quibble about whether or not they're little things, but you get the idea. Things like that. So he's a very controversial candidate. He's almost kind of Trumpy in a way. Well, he's akin to Donald Trump, let's say, in that sense. He's kind of the Brazilian equivalent. So there's some concern that he may be radical, that he may win the election and, you know, God knows what he does. But it's not clear that he could win in a runoff. I think I was reading that he hypothetically could win the election, but not the runoff election that would come after, because he probably wouldn't get beyond 50% of the vote. I think that's the bare minimum to avoid a runoff in Brazil. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. So it's a very colorful election. All of that is basically just illustrating how colorful an election it is. People are looking for an outsider candidate, but there's so much, there's been so many corruption allegations that the field has basically been left to some eccentric candidates. I think the other one that was mentioned was a guy named Seeks. One of you Brazilians who listens, I asked about Bolsonaro, and you mentioned that you weren't as afraid of him as you were of Seeks, I think his name was. I think he's like a popular leftist candidate. I tried looking at his political platform, and it didn't really look all that different from any of the other usual leftist political platforms. So, if you're Brazilian listening, this can be my question for the stream to the Brazilians listening. What is it about Seeks that would concern you? Assuming you don't support him anyway, if you are a critic of Seeks, I know I'm mispronouncing his name, I'm probably not even remembering it right, but hopefully they know who I mean. What is the critique of Seeks as a candidate? Because I haven't heard nearly as much about him as I had about Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro is basically getting all of the news coverage. Again, like Donald Trump, be controversial and everybody pays attention to you, so the other candidates haven't gotten nearly as much press. But yeah, that's kind of where the election is at right now. If I had to make a prediction, I would say it'd go to a runoff and then some more moderate candidate would win. Maybe that's wishful thinking. I've made that prediction a number of times now in a number of elections over the past year and change. And a lot of them have ended up being wrong. But if I had to guess, that would be my bet for the most likely outcome. Who's to say? Elections have been surprising the past few years, to say nothing else, so we'll see. In these relatively peaceful times, having World War III happening seems unlikely. But since circumstances can change quickly, what are your thoughts on the likelihood of international institutions like NATO and the UN being able to stop history from repeating? We talked about this last week, pretty much. World War III is to give a quick summary, World War III is unlikely because nuclear weapons, principally because of nuclear weapons. Any war between great powers would result in mutually assured destruction. So that's the biggest deterrent to World War III, more than NATO or the UN. I don't think if there were tensions between great powers escalating, that NATO or the UN would really be able to stop them. If the nuclear deterrent can't stop it, then that's probably it. That's game, set, match for civilization. The UN was not really designed... the UN was not designed to really manage... well, it was designed to manage tensions between great powers. So if tensions were arising such that a conflict was likely, and the UN had to actually do something to stop it, the UN does not have the tools to do that. It was never intended to. The UN was never intended to be an institution that stops wars. It's only really meant to be a place where rivals can negotiate and try to and in turn mitigate the likelihood of a conflict. But by itself, it wasn't meant to stop them from happening. NATO was designed to stop conflicts from happening by acting as a deterrent. So hypothetically, the combined military power of NATO could act as a deterrent. But again, it would just depend on the context of whatever tensions were emerging. If tensions get so bad that World War III is actually possible, then that probably means there was... this goes back to what I was saying last week. That probably means there was some kind of misread or miscalculation on the part of a world leader. And, ignorant world leaders who miscalculate, there's no end to the destruction that can lead to. Fundamentally, if you see that there's a deterrent and you just misread that as not being enough to deter you, you're just going to go ahead. That's basically World War I and the secret treaties, right? There was a lot of secret treaties that people didn't know about, and maybe if they'd have been public, that could have changed the diplomatic calculus such that World War I wouldn't have broken out. That's a very rough reading on that. I'm sure it's much more complicated than that, but that's a rough example. So that's, again, short version of the answer I gave last week. Let's see. To elaborate more on the Three Kingdoms question, it was more of a question on how they may utilize their economic and military power to get what they want. And since it's on a worldwide scale, there are bound to be conflicts to occur. Would we see cases of things such as China allying with the US to stop another power, then proceed to go back to fighting afterwards? Or would we see something more like proxy wars? in the case of China and the U.S., I don't think they would ally with each other against, say, Russia, because both of them are very large and have very distinctive interests. So they would probably, in that case, in terms of the Sino-American relationship, proxy conflicts are more likely. They would probably they're more likely to operate against each other through proxies of one sort or another. Because, and kind of like what I was arguing earlier, Russia is not really a big enough threat to either China or the United States to warrant a Sino-American alliance against Russia. Now, in contrast, Russia does have good reason to play China off the US and US off of China, because again, both of those countries are much more powerful. So there's good incentive to try to play them off each other. This is actually one of the reasons that a Sino-Russian alliance is unlikely, or Sino-Russian alliance is more likely. Yeah, as much as in common as China and Russia have in terms of resenting and wanting to resist American hegemony, there's not enough trust in the Sino-Russian relationship to facilitate a full-on alliance. So I don't think even really they would ally with each other against the United States, or that Russia would ally with the US against China. Russia is going to play the role that ironically, that a lot of countries in the Cold War played, which is to play great powers off of each other for their benefit. And if you're going to play that game, if you are going to play great powers off of each other, it really does not behoove you to side explicitly with one or the other. You do kind of want to keep both powers ambiguous. You want to keep it ambiguous as to which side that you're kind of leaning towards at a given time. So if one gets a little too pushy, or if one gets a little too ambitious, maybe you lean towards the other side. But then when that side in turn starts getting too pushy, then you lean more towards the other side again. So Russia, I could see kind of playing more diplomatic games in that vein, but nothing like an explicit alliance, like you might have seen during the War of the Three Kingdoms. So I guess, thank you for the elaboration. Given the elaboration, then I think, no, it's not a very good analogy in that sense. Because I don't think that that Russia, China, and the United States would behave in anything remotely like that, like the Three Kingdoms would have. Proxy wars, though, yeah, I would definitely agree with that assessment. Let's see.
So I don't know, just to give you a little bit of lore real fast on, we got a European pro gamer who's visiting, and he's asking if this is Destiny stream. Have you heard of Destiny before?
I think you've mentioned him a few times, but I don't really know anything about him.
Yeah, he's another Twitch broadcaster who's quite popular, and he has a more intellectual side to a lot of his content, but the format of it is more of a debate setup, as opposed to, this is more of kind of like an expert host setup, where it's not like you're coming in here with a bunch of bullshit and I'm gonna tell you why you're wrong. That's a little bit more of his approach a lot of the time. It's more argumentative, rather than, like, our areas of expertise are very different, so it's unlikely that one of us is going to be trying to counter the points of the other, because they're different domains.
Yeah. Yeah, different approach. We're not really big on debating. I'm certainly open to criticism. That's for sure. I say dumb shit on here.
Yeah, well,
I try not to.
It also depends how obnoxious and wrong someone is, right? Because the more wrong they are, the more debatable the format is going to be. And another thing that we tend to do a lot is say, well, I'm not an expert on this, so I might be wrong, and if I'm wrong, correct me. A lot of the guests there are like, no, this is how it is. 9/11 was that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff. Which can be fun, and I think it's a valuable exercise to be able to engage with a lot of these arguments and bat it down, so I respect that as a process, but the vibe of this segment is quite a bit different than that.
Yeah.
At least until our April Fool's segment.
Someday. Yeah, debates are more of a competition. It's more kind of a proselytizing activity. it can be productive in outlining arguments and kind of getting into some of the details of an issue, but in general, the competitive aspect tends to overpower the informative aspect. And so for that reason, I'm generally more critical of debates. I would rather just listen to somebody try to break down both sides of an argument themselves and just try to critique it. Because then that's a little more efficient, I think. And I don't have to listen to two people bitch at each other for an hour and a half. I can just kind of get to the meat of the matter.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the different perspectives? What are the different perspectives? You know, what are the costs, benefits, you know, etc. Just break it down for me. You don't need two people to do that. But if you're trying to proselytize, then yes, then you kind of do need that competitive aspect to try to compete with the other person's ideas. But, you know, we're not really proselytizers here. That's not our bag. I'm not here to try to convince people of one viewpoint or the other. You know, in general, the objective is to inform people so that they can better inform their own judgments and decisions and preferences. What they do with the information is entirely up to them. Not my business.
Yeah, but wouldn't you be more successful in a Fox News segment if you told everyone the sky is falling and you know how to fix it?
I would be a lot more successful in a lot of things if I did that. I could just hop onto SoundCloud every day and just have the 15-minute screed against whatever random thing. Hell, I could have multiple SoundClouds.
I don't know,
I could
though.
have one.
Alex Jones, he can't even use PayPal anymore.
Well, caution is advised. You just have to do it right. You have to pick your words, pick your battles. There's no shortage of partisan hacks out there. There's lots of partisan media and lots of people who make a lot of money off of it. So for sure it can be done. I mean, hypothetically, I could set up one SoundCloud for the right and one for the left. And in each one, I could just bitch about whatever issue from each given perspective.
Oh, and, man.
You know, that would probably get a lot of views.
People
so
are
long as
already
it was
getting
done
excited.
the right way.
That's
Yeah,
the
I
good
could even argue with myself at one point. I could have different personalities, different characters I play for each one, and then have a big debate someday between them. It would be a pay-per-view event.
Oh, dude, I'll back you on Patreon if you do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very formulaic business model. You know, if you understand a given perspective well enough, then you can basically just make it up. You can just fake it. And I don't doubt that there's at least a few people who do that for a living.
Yeah, well, that's one of the questions you ask a lot when you have people who are being ridiculous a whole bunch is, does this individual believe their own bullshit?
Mm-hmm.
Some of them do. Some of them, I think, don't, but they understand that it's a really good business model.
Mm-hmm.
So they push a product effectively that they don't believe in because they know that it pays really well.
Mm-hmm. It pays the bills.
Mm-hmm.
Not terribly great for the political culture, but hey, you know, it works for them. And to be fair to the political culture, to be fair to the citizenry, well, not to the citizenry, to be fair, it falls to the citizenry to be resistant to that kind of agent provocateur, so to speak, to that kind of antagonistic style of politics. It comes down to the political culture and the citizenry to be sufficiently resilient in their awareness of politics and human nature and their responsibilities as citizens and democratic norms and institutions to be resistant to that kind of partisan politics. And in so much as politics in the United States in particular are very partisan now, it's because the political culture has failed to do that. Now, there are different reasons for that. That's not just because we're piss poor at it. You know, it used to be pretty good. But, you know, everything is dynamic, and the political culture in the United States responds to stimuli like anything else. So a lot of the technological and economic developments and trends that have occurred over the past few decades have impacted the political culture in arguably a negative way, producing the current negative outcome. Now, if those trends or factors could change, or if we could change how we react to them, hypothetically, we could improve the political culture such that it is more resilient to partisan politics, and such that eventually that style of politics that is very partisan becomes obsolete and an anachronism.
Yeah, but dude, we're primates. We gotta make it sexy. Gotta make it important and exciting.
That's true.
Just saying stuff like, yeah, well, it's complicated and we don't really understand what's going on. People just fall asleep.
That's true. But that is the art of politics.
Yeah.
You know, it's not just a matter of creating a really great system. I mean, obviously the U.S. political system has its flaws, but overall, the U.S. system and equivalent systems pretty well designed. It's not enough just to make the argument that it's a good design. You have to do it in a way that appeals and is congruent with human nature. You know, the best political systems are not the ones that are necessarily the best designed, but the ones where the ones that have the most buy-in from a public. So the United States has an ideal combination of buy-in from the public, a political culture that reinforces democratic institutions, and well-designed democratic institutions. It strikes the balance relatively well. Again, the balance is getting a little bit unbalanced. It's tipping towards a little too much towards one direction, but it's not irretrievable. It's still fixable. It's a problem, but not a catastrophe yet, at least not yet. So in that sense, you're right. If we can find a way of reinforcing our political culture and political systems in a way that does not challenge human nature and base instincts, but rather that taps them, that exploits them, that rides them, that would be the most ideal outcome, because then you're not constantly having this tension between raw human nature and some of the more difficult, abstract notions and concepts that back democratic institutions. I hope this is making sense. This is kind of off the fly.
Off the
If
cuff?
not, off the cuff, yes. Let me.
Why is it coming off your pants?
There you go, off the cuff. Yeah, so I'm sorry if that's confusing, but I'm just kind of shooting the whatever that colloquialism is. What was it?
Off the cuff?
Well, yeah. Let's go with that. Off the cuff. Where were we? Oh, yeah. You were Destiny. You were okay. Yeah, the lore behind the. Gotcha. Yeah, we tried to stick to informing rather than debating, rather than arguing per se. I guess that's the gist of it. To kind of rehash that. Let's see. Your thoughts on U.S. unfunded liabilities such as Social Security and its ability to survive as a world leader in 20 years. I mean, that's eminently fixable. All you have to do is raise taxes and cut spending. You know, that's it. And I think if it really came down to it, the United States government would do that, do whatever was necessary to kind of make that work. It helps a lot to have so much inequality. You know, most of the tax revenue in the United States is paid by the people in, what, the top 10%, top 20% income bracket, that top percentile of income. So ironically, the fact that that group has been doing so well over the past 10, 20 years has actually helped balance the budget, or at least helped with the budget deficit, because those people are paying a lot more in absolute terms in tax revenue. And that actually that's what helped the Obama administration balance the budget back in the day. I keep saying balance the budget. I don't mean balance the budget. I just mean bring the deficit under control. You know, a lot of that increase in tax revenue that happened under the Obama administration came from taxes paid from that top income bracket. Increases in the tax revenue paid from that top income bracket. So hypothetically, we could see more of that if there is more, for one, economic growth in general, but also in particular for that top tier. It could be that the problem just takes care of itself. That's probably unlikely. We're probably going to have a shift in politics towards more redistribution at some point in the next 10, 20 years. So that could present a problem then. But hypothetically then, the tax base would broaden and there would be more revenue from other income groups, ideally. That's how you would deal with that. But yeah, I'm not pessimistic, per se. I think there is a challenge from the Social Security program and its finances. The demographics of the United States are not ideal. Ideally, if you're going to have a program like that, you have a young population that's much larger than your older population, so that when they come, when they're of working age, it doesn't cost much per person to fund Social Security payments to the older retired workers. As is, it's inverted. So the number of working people is actually a bit smaller, the number of older folks retiring, and so that's creating a big strain because the workers have to pay more per worker to fund those obligations, to fund those Social Security payments. So then how do you square that circle? How do you pay for all that in the long run? And again, it's just going to come down to cutting spending and raising taxes. There's pretty much no other way around it. And so the real question then is one of political will. Is there political will to do that? And I think if it came to it, then yes. Whether or not it reaches a crisis or not is debatable. But I think one way or the other, whether it's because a crisis is imminent or because cooler heads prevail, so to speak, eventually there will be the sufficient policy remedy to deal with the issue. It doesn't all have to be paid off. You don't have to pay off all U.S. debt or completely cull the Social Security program, because inflation will take care of some of that. Inflation eats away at some of the value of the debt, so that'll free up some space right there, so long as you're not just incurring huge amounts of new debt in the meantime. People don't like inflation, but it does serve a purpose. For one, it encourages people to buy where they might not otherwise, and two, it does kind of minimize the impact of debt over the long term. So if you have to take on a lot of debt in the now, then eventually the long-term cost isn't as bad because you've got inflation kind of eating away at it. Let's see. As for the U.S.'s ability to survive as a world leader in 20 years, I have a lot of confidence in the American oligarchy, so to speak. And it's that's a controversial statement. I would not argue that the United States is an oligarchy, but certainly the United States does have an elite class of people who kind of have a distinctive background and who are a little bit different and tend to not monopolize, but tend to disproportionately have representation in government and elite institutions. And those people are really on the ball. Those people really know their shit. They've been on the horse for a long time, and I don't expect them to fall off anytime soon. So I fully expect them, one way or the other, by hook or by crook, to maintain the United States as a powerful nation in the world. If for no other reason than they've just proven to be very good at it over the course of American history. Whether that entails meeting the public halfway and meeting a lot of the demand for more redistributive policies or not, maybe. I suspect probably there will be a shift in that direction, but it's not inevitable. They don't have to do that. Keep in mind, the United States is a country that is not historically very pro-labor. And the means by which anti-labor, well, not necessarily anti-labor, but pro-capital policies have been favored and consistently favored, have not always been terribly peaceable. There was in the, I think, 1920s, I want to say, there was a strike by miners in West Virginia. And the strikers decided to march on Washington. It was either Washington or maybe it was Charleston, the capital of West Virginia. I don't quite remember. But basically, the capital, basically the owners of the mine, resisted that, and they actually paid people to fight them. And I don't mean like fisticuffs. I mean, they set up a machine gun nest in the path, and they had a firefight. The strikers themselves had guns, so there was an actual battle in West Virginia between the strikers and the people that the business had hired. And believe it or not, they actually hired an aircraft to drop bombs on the miners. It wasn't like a bomber or anything. It was just like a guy in his plane, but they were chucking out grenades basically at them. That's an example of how tense it can get. Now, obviously, it hasn't been that bad in a long time here in the United States, but it illustrates that when push comes to shove, American capital has an extra gear than other equivalent countries. They have a lot more political acumen, political power and influence than business and capital in other countries. And so that kind of gives them extra capacity, political capital, so to speak. And for that reason, I suspect that if it comes down to a choice between sacrificing, potentially very damagingly so, American power in the world, and making that compromise, giving up that power, and maybe implementing more social policies that alleviate political pressure in the United States, I suspect that that traditional form of politics could return. Maybe not in a violent fashion, but maybe in some other fashion that is sufficiently coercive or compelling to divert that pro-labor push for pro-labor policies. Again, I don't know what that would look like, but given American history, there is that pattern. And one of my pet theories that I've talked a little bit about on here before is that the course of American history that we've been on for the past few decades is a reversion to mean. That is to say, becoming more like what the United States was before World War II and before the crises of the mid-20th century. A lot of the trends in the United States now kind of suggest that the United States might look a lot more like that pre-war America. You know, there's that isolationism, mass inequality, pro-business politics, left-wing labor agitation. You know, a lot of that old school pre-war politics seems to be coming back. To say nothing of the economic inequality and political partisanship. You know, all of that was also a hallmark of the period. So there's an argument to be made that there's a reversion to mean. So it could be that there's a reversion to that as well. You know, that pro-business, forceful, muscular, pro-capital style of politics that the United States government used to kind of be defined by. Anyway, that's a really long-winded answer to that question. Basically, yeah, I think the United States will be fine. That's the short version of that question. You know, whether it adjusts, makes the necessary adjustments. Well, I think it'll definitely make the necessary adjustments, but it's just a matter of what those adjustments will look like. I think that's the bigger question, and that's what I don't know. You know, that's kind of unclear at this point in American history. Ideally, it'll be democratic and peaceful, but if not, I think the United States would still come out fine. Actually, this is a good quote for this. I'm reminded of an old quote by Bismarck. And I'm going to look it up, because I'm pretty sure I would butcher it.
Otto von Bismarck.
Otto von Bismarck. The quote was, God has a special providence for fools, drunks, and the United States of America. And that's a reference for the unique luck the United States has had historically. You know, we've got a lot of factors that have either just kind of just happened to come out well for the United States, or that facilitated, you know, different trends that kind of were favorable to the United States. Just in general, the United States is a lucky country. And, you know, not all of that is luck. Some of that is hard work, skill, you know, intelligence, foresight, planning, what have you. But it all comes together to make the United States at least look very lucky. So in that sense, even if the United States doesn't adjust in a terribly ideal way, it might do so in a way that is less than ideal, but still very effective in maintaining American prosperity and power. So I suspect that would be the outcome, even if certain political forces are not alleviated, so to speak. I hope I'm using the right word there, alleviated. Even if certain political pressures are not alleviated. Anyway, I've been looking for an excuse to use that Bismarck quote. It's one of my old favorites. Yeah, it's an old quote. It's more than 100 years old by now, I think. But I think it still has merit. There's still a kind of childlike luck the United States enjoys sometimes. Anyway, sorry, distracting myself. Let's see, I'm curious, what's your take on Taiwan, long-term future? Will they ever declare independence? If yes, do you foresee two Chinas or two Taiwans? Long-term, again, to kind of go back to an old canard on here, long-term is very hard to predict. It's just inherently difficult. Because there's a lot of variables that you think are fixed over the long term can become fluid. You know, nothing is fixed over the long term, and so some of those core assumptions that you need to make a good prediction, you just can't make over the long term. So I preface my answer with that. I can't really know over the long term. But my take on Taiwan, they're really just stuck. You know, they can't really move one way or the other. You know, China's economy is too important to the success and health of Taiwan's economy for Taiwan to really ever take a dramatic political step like declaring independence, because invariably there would be significant economic fallout from that, because the Chinese government would not take that line down. So on the one hand, there's that factor, but then from the perspective of the United States, we don't really want to go to war over Taiwan. We're very sympathetic to Taiwan. We would prefer that there not be a violent resolution to the dispute. But we also really don't want to antagonize China because there's a significant trading relationship with China, and because a war in Taiwan would be very difficult, militarily speaking, for the United States military. So there would be a lot of risk involved.
Sympathy is a lot less expensive than war.
Yeah. Yeah, so the attitude of the United States government is, yes, we will support Taiwan if the Chinese government takes an aggressive act to resolve takes an aggressive, aggressively tries to resolve the dispute with Taiwan. But the corollary to that is that the United States will not support Taiwan if Taiwan unilaterally declares independence. That's kind of an unspoken norm in terms of U.S.-Taiwan policy, and everybody knows it. It's an unspoken norm, but it's mutually understood by all parties involved. The United States will go to bat with Taiwan if China forces the issue, but if Taiwan forces the issue, then they're on their own, because we're not real gung-ho about going to China. So the result is that Taiwan does not have enough support from the United States to declare independence or enough of an independent economy, but does not trust the Communist Party of China enough to integrate. Because they see what's happening in Hong Kong, and they just don't trust any of that. It's bad juju written all over it. So for now, it's going to be status quo. I would predict over the short to medium term that Taiwan and its relationship with China is going to just be stuck where it is now, more or less interminably. Now, over the long term, who's to say? It may be that China gets powerful enough that they think they can make a play, or maybe they reach some kind of understanding with the US, or who's to say, maybe Taiwan even just agrees to become a part of China. Or if you really want to shoot high, if you really want to, you could say that China democratizes, and then that facilitates a peaceful reunification between democratic China and democratic Taiwan. That's over the very long term, because I don't think that's in the cards anytime soon. But again, who's to say? But for now, I just don't think there's just enough leverage on the part of the Taiwan government to really make a big move by itself. And I don't think the US government is going to change its position on the issue. Hypothetically, the Trump administration might just try to use Taiwan as leverage, but I think they'd really be pushing their luck at that point. You know, China's military is not quite powerful enough to really challenge the US military, but it's getting close. And you know, keep in mind when I say that, I'm talking about the Chinese military challenging the US military in the Taiwan Straits specifically. That's right next door to China. That's well within the range of, you know, their air force, their aircraft, their navy. It's right in their wheelhouse. That's not a stretch for them to project force right there. So they would be fighting from a favorable position in that sense. The US, meanwhile, is, you know, it has to project force from across an ocean. And I know it has bases in Okinawa and Guam, etc., but that's not the same thing as having, you know, the whole of mainland China. It's just a whole different ballgame. Now, on China's part, the Communist Party of China does not give that much of a shit to really want to force the issue in the first place. For the Communist Party of China, they've got their hands full dealing with 1+ billion Chinese. So their attitude is, let's just leave that there. And maybe it solves itself at some point. Basically, it's going to be somebody else's problem some point down the line. You know, that comes down to the risk-averse political culture in China. You don't want to dig into a problem if you can avoid it. And right now, Taiwan is a problem the government can avoid, and so they do. It's just more of a headache than it's worth dealing with. Because, you know, if you do occupy Taiwan, if you do successfully occupy Taiwan, even then you have to deal with the restive unsettled population, and that's a problem in and of itself. Much easier to just leave them be. As long as they don't cause too much trouble, most likely the Communist Party of China is not going to really see it as worth the cost that would be incurred, that would have to be incurred from invading, conquering, and subjugating the island. To say nothing of fallout, economic and political fallout from escalated tensions with the United States and other countries. So they're probably good for the foreseeable future. They may not like the status quo, but that's probably what they're stuck with. Let's see, is there any indication that Korea will try to rein in cabal firms like Samsung, Hyundai, or are they explicitly consenting to the cronyism provided they remain profitable? They're not really nearly as powerful as they used to be. So I don't know that they really need to rein them in too much. They're definitely politically powerful, sure. But I don't know that they're so politically powerful that the government really needs to kind of clamp down on them, per se. You know, there was a push in the 90s by the South Korean government to try to get these cabals to be more independent and less dependent on ties to the government. And you know, that's not to say they have not traditionally been export-oriented and competitive, but they've had a somewhat incestuous relationship with Seoul, with South Korea's government. And when the Asian financial crisis hit, there was a pretty strong desire by the South Korean government to cut them loose, because that was a very expensive crisis for them, not only in terms of the lost investment, but in terms of the money they had to spend to help them out. That's my understanding of it anyway. If you're from South Korea, or if you're more familiar with that issue, please do elaborate and chat on that, but that's my understanding. Still politically powerful, but the government, the South Korean government, kind of divested themselves of responsibility for not ensuring their success, but at least helping them. But I don't know that there's a whole lot else you could really do beyond that. So I would not argue that they're consenting to cronyism. I think South Korean political culture, not as corrupt as it used to be, still a little bit of a problem with corruption. But I think the political influence that the cabals have is not due to cronyism per se. I think it's more just the natural political influence that you would expect a large economic actor and employer to have in a democratic political system. Again, I'm not an expert on South Korea, so maybe somebody who knows better can kind of correct me on that, but that is my impression as things stand right now. So with that, those are all the questions. And so I wanted to actually, for one, I wanted to ask you, Neuro, did you have any thoughts on China banning Twitch?
Yeah, we saw lots of posts about that. They were saying that that was kind of tied in with the cracking down on gaming addiction. And there's a little bit of a point of confusion there, because watching a broadcast is more like TV than the feedback loops you get from playing games. So generally there isn't a ton of overlap, so from a business perspective, for me personally, it's not really going to affect me that much, since Chinese viewers are the most likely to watch Chinese speaking streams.
Yeah.
There will be some, but most people use a VPN in China, from what I understand, if they're going to watch or browse the web outside of Chinese sites. It's more like people who used to watch Twitch at work won't be able to do that anymore. That's kind of the demographic that gets screwed over by this. But yeah, it's one of those things where if they're really trying to make a statement, like a broad-based statement to change gaming addiction, then they feel like maybe that's something they need to whack down.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. So not too much of a problem then.
It's all about the symbolism.
Yeah.
Once again, it's not like Twitch is evil and they've discovered that it's a morally reprehensible thing to browse Twitch streams.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, yep. We have problems with kids not getting jobs and being economical, and they're just playing video games instead, so Twitch must go down.
Well, it's okay. We've still got the good China. We've still got Taiwan.
Oh yeah, we talked about before they called it Chinese Taipei for nation wars.
Yeah.
Yeah, got a lot of people kind of grumpy. They always made
Well,
a scene about that every time it was said on the broadcast.
you know, you can't blame the business. They got to do what they got to do.
Well, someone is saying the Chinese government wants to promote their own streaming sites. I don't know anything about that, but I wouldn't be surprised if there were Chinese-specific streaming sites and that would benefit them. But they could have also taken those down, too.
Mm-hmm. I haven't heard much. Well, I noticed we have 3 people in Japan. I don't know if they're Japanese or not, but 3 people in Japan listening. I see that in our little handy-dandy country chart here.
Mm-hmm.
So before we I assume we're kind of nearing the wrap-up point.
Yeah.
So before we kind of enter that phase, I wanted to ask them how the Abe government is doing. I think there was a vote recently within his political coalition on his continued rule. I think his continued state as head of the coalition. I think he did pass that. But I was a little curious if he still has a lot of support or not. Maybe you guys can kind of fill me in on that, because I haven't read much about Japanese politics in a while, so I'm not really sure what's going on there. He's been in a little bit of trouble from some corruption scandal type stuff. There was the school that his wife, I think, ostensibly arranged to have handed over at below market rates to, well, the land that the school was built on was sold at below market rates to a nationalist group that set up like this really creepy, super ultra-nationalist kindergarten, basically. But I haven't heard much beyond that.
We're the best, we're the best, we're the best. I pledge allegiance to this country and promise to grow up with extreme nationalist fervor.
Banzai. I think we, if you're French and you're listening, I had a question for you too. How do you think Macron is going to do going forward? Because his approval rating is like 30% now. It's not great. But a lot of the policy stuff he's doing is actually pretty decent from an analytical perspective. I don't know if you agree or disagree with it, but it seems like he's at least trying to address a lot of those underlying structural problems in the French economy and to a lesser degree the political system. So I'm curious what some French people over there kind of perceive him, how they perceive him, and if they think he's going to be able to continue to have enough political capital to continue his reform effort.
Wasn't he kind of perceived as a sort of outsider candidate? Like a very different personality than Trump, but I thought he was coming from more of a business angle, kind of in a similar capacity.
Yeah, he has one of the accusations against him is that he's a imperial president, a monarchical president, and he's just a little too enmeshed in the grandeur. That's partly by design, because he wants to try to do that to kind of build up presidential power, to try to get more influence, basically, so that it's easier to get reforms passed. But that is the accusation, that he's very arrogant and haughty, and that he takes too much of a imperial attitude towards policy making and passing legislation.
Some people serve the public in office. Some people enjoy the office. They play that shit up. Look at me. I've got my entourage. I'm the most powerful person in the country. What's up with it?
That's a very good way of putting that.
And the other one you could kind of use, it comes to mind whenever you hear about Trump's golf spending and that kind of stuff, is that you can be a public servant or you can get into a seat where the public serves you more than ever before. Not to serve, but to be served.
I think we did have... I'm looking through this chart and I'm trying to think of stuff I can ask them. Oh, we've got 7 Swedes, or people in Sweden. So I guess I would ask any Swedes listening, But how do you feel about the new government? Because you guys just had elections and everybody, well, a lot of people were concerned that maybe there would be a significant far-right victory by that far-right political party, but it didn't really pan out. So I'm kind of curious how you guys feel about the new government and if you think it's efficacious and just, I guess, perspective in general. Anyway, I don't want to keep you up all night.
Yeah, it's been a fun conversation today. We had some really funny games too.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And this has been episode 38 of World Discussion with Wait, what degrees does this guy have? Why is he talking? What is this? Is this a recording? You know.
Yeah.
That's one of those things that we've gotten a lot more volume of just because we've hit a new tier in terms of viewership, so we're higher in the list, which means a bunch of new people click in here and they're like, what's going on? You probably get to see that when you comb through the chat after.
Yeah, yeah.
What is this?
Yeah, people kind of just sitting around gaming, thought they'd turn on a stream, and then all of a sudden, Nazis and communism. What?
What? Why is he talking about the Baltics? And then they're like, it's Ukraine, it's not the Ukraine, you fool!
Yeah. No, I appreciate the humor. I do enjoy that. I get a kick out of it.
Alright, well thanks Macedonian Prototype for handling the questions this time, and it was his first time. I think he did a great job.
You did. Thank you very much, sir.
And thank you all the awesome viewers who asked fun and interesting questions that we got to attempt to tackle. And everyone else for listening. But this will be on YouTube if you missed part of this, or if you want to watch any of the previous episodes. It's in a playlist called War Discussion with Agent Smith. Yes, he has a podcast. Put the link for it in the chat. Yeah, thank you, sir, for coming on. It's been a good one.
Yep, thanks for having me. Lots of fun.
Until next time. Sweet. Minimal hostility. Yep. Whenever we have these discussions, we set the hostility levels to a minimum. Just the appropriate amount of hostility.